Okay, so when we recycle the clay, something you have to understand is basically I take dry clay, I re-wet it. In other words, I dissolve the clay in water and becomes this slurry, and then I mix it up in kind of like a blender, if you will. Okay, now what you have to understand is that clay particles are basically rectangular shape, or shaped like bricks, if you will. So when we put it in the blender, so to speak, okay, they're going to be just kind of haphazardly, just kind of all over the place. I know some of these are squares, but you get the idea. There's no real rhyme or reason to them, and there's no pattern to it. And so what happens is, and then the other thing that you have to understand is that in between all these little clay particles, now this is like on a molecular level, we're talking about, you know, not necessarily, you wouldn't be able to see these unless you looked at them with a microscope. So in between all of these clay particles is water. And that's what causes it to be kind of fluid and rubbery, if you will. We call that being plastic, okay? But the problem is that when the clay particles are not lined up perfectly, it's not structurally very sound. So what happens is when you bend it too far, it'll actually break, okay? And if I can, maybe I can get a piece of clay like this, okay? Now this clay again is really wet, but what you'll notice is that as I bend it, okay, see the little cracks starting to develop? And if I bend it a little bit more, it cracks and cracks and cracks. And what happens is that clay is what we call short, okay? In other words, it takes a very short amount of time to bend it and start to crack and break. Now, if this clay was even thinner, it would crack and break completely and come apart. As you're trying to form things, that's a bad thing, all right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a process called wedging. Like I mentioned, it's very similar to kneading the dough of bread. And what it does is it aligns all of our clay particles, our little rectangles, in kind of like a brick pattern, okay? Now this is important, okay, because something that has this kind of brick pattern is going to be much more flexible, okay? Now, don't forget the water that's in between. That's gonna allow these clay particles to float, so to speak, on top of one another. Okay, so here when we bend, it starts to crack. But here, if we start to bend it, what happens is these will flex, and therefore it will cause it to be more rounded, and you can get a better bend on the clay with it before it breaks. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. Wedging is gonna help us create that, and therefore I'll show you that in the next video.